World Trade Organization resulted from the efforts after World War II as countries began to see the advantages of cooperation and of larger market sizes. As I mentioned earlier, democracies don't tend to attack each other politically for good or for bad. They tend to cooperate because it's in their own economic interest to have free trade, and this cross-flow makes a big difference here. I've heard some interesting comments about the increase of the military in China, which I mentioned in the last video. In my opinion, has very little to do with expansionistic ideals. Of course, I don't know what I'm talking about from an insider point of view here. I just talked to a lot of people that have also worked in China. It has to do with their own, internal volatilities here. They're not democratic yet, though, and this is what makes me a little bit nervous, because democracy like India or Brazil, or even I'll use the word quasi-democracy like Russia, and I use that guardedly, of course, the chances of them actually attacking a Western democracy, the United States or one in Europe, are very small because of the cross-border economic flow. So the integration into a common market makes people, peaceful. Free trade agreements result in trade creation and trade diversion as barriers drop for the member countries but remain higher for non-member countries. There are also the static effects of the reduction of the trade barriers, and at the end of this video I'll go back into that in more detail. It's important to know that the static effects of an economic integration actually improve the efficiency of the resource allocation and affect both production and consumption. So the dynamic effects are usually the ones that get people the most concerned. They are internal and external efficiencies that arise because of the changes in the market size. So the downside is that there's, like I mentioned, the potential for protectionism. This is usually reduced or eliminated between member countries. Trade creation allows multinational companies to specialize and trade based on a comparative advantage and not trying to squeak through with a product advantage because that's what they can get away with legally. So it's a higher form of trade. Basically, the fewer restrictions, the higher the form of trade. Let's just make that an oversimplification for this point. Trade diversification occurs when the supply of products shifts from countries that are not members of the economic bloc that they belong to. Regional trade organizations, as opposed to global ones, integrates because of the greater ease of cooperation on a smaller scale. Probably the best example is the European Union. It is an effective common market that has abolished most restrictions on factor mobility, like we talked about in the last chapter, and is harmonizing, that's present perfect, in the process of harmonizing national political, economic, and social policies. It's not finished. I live there. They can agree on very few things here, and when the European Union was formed in the late 80s, early 90s, American policymakers and American business people, my instructors at MBA school, were all saying, this is going to be the biggest market. They're really going to challenge us on every front. Now, several decades later, we're no longer concerned about the European Union becoming the dominant market, or at least replacing our competitive advantage, because we know that they just can't get together. In the meantime, several countries have rejected the EU, England, Denmark, other countries have never entered the EU, Switzerland, and places beyond. Your book does a very good job of explaining how that happened and why that is happening here. The EU has abolished trade barriers in a, let's call it an intrazonal trade, instituted a common external tariff, in other words, a tax, created a common currency, the euro, and has basically allowed for companies to cross-border trade. This is all fine on the product level here. Where this is becoming a little bit sticky at the moment in Europe is on the employment level. As companies look for cheap labor, which is sometimes from another country, which is neighboring on. Like I said, I live in Germany, and we can get cheap labor from Poland, which would be, like Wisconsin getting it from Illinois. It's just not that far away. And as these Polish laborers come in and do, let's just say 3/4 of the quality for half the price, people can see how they really don't need to be as perfect as they used to be. German quality with German precision, with German everything wonderful. For half the price, I can get a decent quality. What makes a difference here? My next door neighbor recently renovated her house and was using Polish labor because she said, I don't need a perfect German house. And she only told this to me. She didn't tell it to the German neighbors. She thought I would appreciate her humor. She said, I don't need a perfect German house. And I was very happy to be able to renovate it for half the cost. Price makes the difference. In 1994, 1995, we formulated the NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement. And in my opinion, a lot of this came into play because the North Americans, in other words, the United States, Canada, and Mexico, were nervous about the advent of the EU, thought they needed to band a little bit more together in order to ward off the competitive anticipated advantage. Basically, what the NAFTA tries to do is eliminate tariff barriers and liberalize investment opportunities and trade services. Some of the key provisions in the NAFTA are labor and environmental agreements. Your book does a very good job of explaining how these things shifted from one side to the other. You want to take a close look at those. So then we also have the United Nations, not necessarily an economic institution. As you know, it's composed mostly of representatives from countries, and it influences international trade, however, in many significant ways. The main point that the United Nations does as far as economics goes is keep the hot spots, the political flare-up points in the forefront where people can discuss them and give air to this. I don't see the United Nations as having ever really made a significant offensive political forefront, but in the defensive way, they've been able to calm down a lot of the hot spots, put in troops. Recently, I was in Israel talking to some of the United Nations security troops there, the blue hats as they're called, and they say, on a good day, nothing happens. On a good day, people see our blue helmets, and they rest in peace and go about their business. That's why we're there. And that's a good thing. So if I had to recommend for my son a soldier position, he's wanted to be a soldier all of his life. I've always, pushed the United Nations on him, and he's considered that to be pretty boring. But that's besides the point. Okay, many developing countries rely on commodity exports to supply hard currency. Hard currency means that it comes from a country which has a good economy. The money means something versus a soft currency. It means the money doesn't mean a whole lot. It doesn't really trade very well. Maybe it comes from a country where the money is actually traded better on the black market than on the official market. So this instability in commodity prices comes into the earnings pictures here. We have commodity organizations, probably the most famous is the OPEC, as you know, which regulates the flow of the oil supply. The Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries is generally still until today led by Saudi Arabia. And that in and of itself has its advantages because the Saudi Arabians are admirably, and I'll be very careful here with my words, admirably friendly to the West, without overstepping their cultural limitations and religious values. It's very interesting to see how countries like Venezuela and Russia can also have an effect on the commodities market. Not too recently, we had an oil commodity hike. Was it due to the fact that the OPEC was limiting supply, or was it due to the fact that speculators were buying up oil reserves at a certain price and then reselling it at an unfair higher price to control the supply? I don't know. I don't think we will ever be able to really determine that. The simple matter is, without the OPEC, it could have actually been worse.